right, welcome everybody. We're going to have a really interesting conversation today on the power of listening and building deeper connections. I've got with me Ross Judd, who's just released a book on exactly that, and we're going to go through some of the concepts in the book, and also I'll be asking Ross questions. We'll have a conversation about listening because, as we were talking just before we hit record, listening is one of those skills that most people are pretty average at. It's one of those things, I know that for myself, even when I know a lot about listening these days from coaching, but it's one of those things where I still know I could do better. Now, Ross is a leadership coach. He's a highly respected author and consultant. He's known for his insights on leadership and culture. So I know this is going to be really valuable for the audience. So welcome, Ross.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Wonderful. All right. So I wanted to give the audience a bit of an idea about the concepts in the book. And I do realise, in having a look through and having a read, that you've got some really valuable models in here. You've got the integrated values iceberg and also your Rio Star process. So can you talk us through those?
Sure. And in hindsight, I probably could have named them different things. But anyway, so the integrated values iceberg, as I wrote the book, what I was concerned about is that when we get into a listening situation, most of us fall back into our bad habits. And, we ask questions or we tell stories or we try to direct the conversation or we're opinionated. All of those sorts of things happen. And so I was really working hard on how can I help people change those habits for when it matters. So the integrated values iceberg is basically the amalgamation of a model I've used for over 30 years in the coaching and consulting work I've done, which I borrowed, used from Robert Dilts. And he talks about working at a deeper level, and he particularly talks about working at the beliefs, identity, and purpose level. And I've worked with that with leadership and in leadership development for a long time and found it to be profoundly, very powerful. But I've struggled with it because I've placed this is a terrible sentence, I've placed a high value on values. So I'm really a big fan of people knowing what their values are, thinking carefully about their values. And I've wondered for years and years how values fit into that model. And what I did was I thought carefully about it and came up with the realization that in actual fact, each level of the model is a level of values. And when I did that, it helped me iron out some of the problems I'd personally had with doing values setting work, which is that when I've done it with people and done it myself, I found that I tend to confuse different types of values and try to have them in the same conversation. So if we were trying to value, when you ask someone about their values, they're going to say family, but then they might also talk about their career, or they might talk about, some people even talk about possessions, their house or their car. And it's like, how would you have a comparison? Because values are comparative. How would you compare, something like your family with something like a car or, your health and so it made me realize that actually there are different levels of values, and that's what the integrated values iceberg helps you now do. And it's basically asking you to think at 5 different levels. So when you want to do something and achieve something, and in the context of this book, it's encouraging you to think about how you want to appear as a listener when somebody really needs your help. So you need to think about what's the outcome that you want to achieve and what do you value most at that level. Then you need to think about how you want to behave in that moment. So that's sort of going a bit deeper. That's why it's an iceberg. I'm trying to convey this idea of going deeper. So how you want to behave goes a little bit deeper. Then you need to think about, what will I need to think in that moment? What thoughts will I need to value most when somebody really needs my help? For example, a lot of people will be driven by a belief. So thoughts, beliefs, mindsets, I've lumped all that together. A lot of people will be driven by a belief that I need to help this person, and help for them will mean fix their problem. And in those moments when they really need support, they don't want you to fix their problem. They want you to actually go deeper and understand what the problem actually is first. So that belief, what do I need to believe? And then the next level is, who do I want to be? What's my identity in that moment? And then the final level, the deepest level, is what's my purpose in this moment? What am I trying to achieve at a longer, bigger perspective? What's bigger than me in this moment? What's the greater purpose? And I've called that greater purpose values. So there's 5 levels of values: your outcome values, your behavioral values, your belief values, I've called them character values. They're the ones that set your identity, and then your greater purpose values. And they're designed to help you really think thoroughly through what you want to achieve in that moment. And just the last comment I'll make, that model I've used now. I designed it as I was writing the book, and I've used it for 3 or 4 years now in the coaching that I've done. And you can use it on any topic. The big thing I say to people is a lot of people see the model and want to apply it to their whole life. And I advocate against that. I would suggest to you apply it to a specific aspect of your life. You'll find it extremely powerful in that way. So if you're thinking about who you want to be as a leader or how you want to be as a leader, apply the 5 levels to that. Or as a parent, or as a listener, or as a sports person playing whatever sport you like to play, whatever it might be, apply it to that.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a great explanation. I do love the iceberg model. It's something that us OD consultants have known about for a long time. We trot it out a fair bit,
We do. And lots of different guises.
Yes,
Lots of different
exactly.
versions of it. But it's the iceberg itself just conveys this idea of going
Deeper
deeper.
levels.
Yeah,
And
deeper
things
levels.
beneath the surface that aren't obvious and you can't see. And I really like that. And the other model you've got in here, which is your Rio Star process. So can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So the restart process is a 7-step process designed to help you with that conversation. So it's designed for a specific scenario, and that is when someone that you care about, it needs that deeper level of connection. So they'll be worried or concerned or feeling vulnerable or just not themselves because they might be upset, whatever it might be. Vulnerability is the thing that sort of denotes this context. And so the Rio star is an anagram, and I like anagrams. I think a lot of us do. They just make it easier to remember. So the R stands for recognizing that particular type of situation. So, and the way you recognize that you're not doing this with strangers, you're doing this with people that you know. So you'll recognize that something's bothering them either through their behavior, it'll be unusual, or it'll be different. They might even ask you, or you might notice they might be hesitating. You might just, you could just tell sometimes through their body language and their energy that this is really important to them. So the first step is to recognize that this is a different conversation. And that step's really important to me because someone who wrote this book, a lot of people assume I'm a pretty good listener. And a lot of people throughout my career would say he's terrible, including my children. There's an example with my daughter at the start of the book where I did a great job of listening. And, as consultants, we get to tell the good examples and we rarely share the shocking ones. And later in the book, I share another example where I got in the car with my daughter and I was worried about some stuff at work and I was picking her up from school and she was chattering away. And then she asked me a question and I was like, I just hadn't heard anything and I wasn't even able to fake an answer. She just was like, Dad. I'm like, sorry, I've got stuff on my mind. I didn't hear a word you said. Um, so recognizing and understanding that this is a different situation is a really important step. And I'm probably overemphasizing it a bit, but it's just important to recognize that this person needs help of a different type. So then the next step is to then engage with that person. So that's the E. And that's simply a question of making sure your body language and everything you are doing makes it absolutely clear that they are your focus. So close your laptop. In the example with my daughter, I moved away from my desk and I sat on the floor and she came into the room and sat on the floor. So the different behavior was she was kind of loitering in the doorway of my office. Very unusual for her. She would normally come in and this time she was sort of hanging there and I'm like, that's different. That's what triggered me to realize there's something going on here. So then I just stepped away from my desk, sat on the floor. She then came and engaged with me. And of course she did because she wanted that. So your body language at this point communicates to them that they're going to get what they want. So all the things you need to do, turn off the TV, whatever it might be, just do whatever it needs to be to engage. Now, the next one's the O. This one's quite important because the conversation that you want to have with that person in this context, when they're feeling vulnerable, they will never tell you the real issue straight away. They always start with something else. I call it an audition. They're going to audition you. So if you do your normal listening habits, which are fine at work, asking questions or problem solving, they're all fine at work. But if you do that in this context, you're going to take the conversation away from where that person wants it to go. So in my mind, that's closing down the conversation. So the O is about opening up the conversation. You need to find out what conversation they want to have. So the O is there's 3 key messages in this opening up phase. The first one is just be silent. Just shut up. Let them talk. The second one is if you do need to encourage them, use very neutral statements. So things like tell me more or go on, anything else, just something like that. That doesn't change the direction of the conversation. And if you do that, you'll let them start to open up the conversation and you'll start to find out. So in the example with my daughter, she started talking about an issue at school. And I'd recognized this was a different opportunity. I'd engaged with her. I was now trying to open up the conversation. And in my mind, I knew this was not going to be the deeper issue. Now, I was assuming the deeper issue would be connected to what was going on at school. So maybe that was bothering her in some way that she hadn't opened up about yet. But I couldn't ask any questions because I could be completely wrong and I might go the wrong direction. And the minute you ask a question, they've got to answer it and you've altered the direction of the conversation. So that's the O. Now the S, so the S is summarize. So this is again a very neutral thing. You're trying not to change the direction of the conversation. You want them, so you just need them to know that you're understanding, you're on their wavelength. Other people would call this paraphrasing, reflective listening. It's basically all the same thing. I like simple things, so I just call it summarize. Just summarize what they're saying in your own words as simply as you can. And if you can get it down to 1 or 2 words, then great. If you think you can capture the essence of what they're saying, just get it down to that. Again, we're being very careful not to change the direction of the conversation. So as she talked about things happening at school, I simply summarized what she was saying. So some friends are not including you in activities. And it's tempting to say, what activities are they not including you in? But of course, if I say that, now she's got to talk about the activity. So it's like, that's all she said. So that's all I summarized. So that's the S. The T is then a transition point. And that's a really important step because I talk a lot about you cannot offer an opinion until you are asked. And in a conversation like this, there will be a transition point where they finally ask for your opinion. So in the example with my daughter, she came through and asked, Dad, what should I do? And I like to I like to keep summarizing one more time when that happens. So I use a question. So you'd like my opinion? Yes, I'd like your opinion. Okay. And then I started offering suggestions. Have you thought about talking to the teachers? Are they bullying you? And she had answers for everything that I suggested. So I came up with 3 sort of actions, try making new friends, etc. She thought about them all, was actioning them all. But the idea here is this is the transition point. And so I've gone into the next one, which is the A, which is actions. So the transition is when they ask you for an opinion. The A is then you can then work through some actions. And then the last step, the R, is these last couple of steps very much are just guidelines. By the time you get to this point, hopefully you're morphing into the deeper issue naturally as part of the conversation. So Emily and I talked about actions. Sorry, that's my daughter, Emily. We talked about actions and she had pretty much actioned them all. So the final step is then to say, okay, well, I've called it the real issue check. Is there anything else? And if you get to that point, you have what you've done is you've gone through the audition, you've passed the audition, and you can now say, is there anything else that's bothering you? In my specific example, I actually got really lucky because one of the actions I suggested was maybe we get your mum in here and let's ask your mum what she thinks. She might have some ideas. And Emily reacted very badly to that. So she was like, no, 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 please don't tell mum. Please don't tell mum. So that was me now going right back to the start and recognizing this time the trigger that I responded to was emotion. So her emotion told me that this was now, we're back in a new issue and a much more serious issue. And so I went right back. We were engaged, so that was okay. I had to open up a conversation that she was much more reluctant to talk about. She was slower, more hesitant. I did summarizing as much as I could, but she kind of wasn't saying much. So there was a lot of encouragement. And in actual fact, I ended up encouraging her with suggestions like, it's okay. Because she wanted to talk about her mum, and her mum and I are thick as thieves, So she probably was worried about my reaction. Um, and I basically had to let her know it was okay. You can talk about this. It's okay. Eventually, as we moved through it, she finally opened up and just opened up about some playful teasing that her mother had been doing. And Emily was 10, roughly 10, 8, 9, 10, something like that at the time. And she'd just taken it the wrong way. And in their normal course of life, it didn't matter. But now she was troubled by something. She wanted to talk to her mum and was troubled by that. She just didn't feel comfortable going to her mum. So this one took longer. The summaries were shorter. We then got to another transition point. Dad, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, I actually think you should have a chat with your mum. And she reacted again, didn't like that idea. So we cycled back, came back again, and I suggested, okay, how about if I talk to your mum on your behalf? Um, and so I never, in my example with Emily that I use, I never got to that real issue check because it came up during the actions. The deeper issue came up when I suggested the action of let's invite your mum into the conversation. I then discovered, okay, wow. Um, but if that hadn't have happened, I got lucky. If that hadn't have happened, I then would have said, is there anything else? Is there something else troubling you? And I would have watched carefully for all the hints and clues that I talk about in the chapter on the R about how she responded. Was she slower? Was she more hesitant? Was she more emotional? Was there any hint or clue in her behavior that suggested there was something else going on here? And then I would have tried to work through and uncover whatever that was. So
Mm.
sorry if that was a bit long-winded.
No, that's fine. So it's that recognizing is such an important step of it. So if we look at the work context, how or what advice could you give for leaders on things to watch for that tell them that somebody in their team perhaps needs this kind of conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the work context, this happens even more. So this premise of they won't tell you the real issue if they feel any kind of vulnerability, I think that happens more at work than it does in the home. I mean, at least in the home context, you've got the relationships. At work, we feel vulnerable because our career, our income, our well-being, everything that's attached to earning an income is attached to whether we keep our job, whether we stay in favor with the boss, all of those sorts of things. So that feeling of vulnerability, I think, causes people to not disclose the real issue more frequently at work. I hope I've said that correctly. Yes. I think that's happening more. So that's the first sort of response is as leaders, I would actually be watching for it more than I would at home. Now, the question is, what are you watching for? I think the clues are more subtle at work as well. So the first big clue, there's kind of two big clues for me. One is any kind of unusual behavior. So if it's not, in the case of the example with my daughter, she just hung around in the doorway. That was so unusual. So if somebody that you work with, hesitates or asks a question that seems out of character or sort of doesn't seem to commit to something the way you might have expected them to, or makes a comment about someone else, I think you've got to be switched on, and these clues that people give you are a little bit harder to pick up. But if you watch out for them, they're a gold mine when you spot them. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. You don't have to do this 100% of the time. So if you just tuned in a bit and you pick up on some opportunities, you'll start to make life easier for yourself as a leader. So you don't have to try to pick up on every single opportunity. That's almost impossible. But if you start picking up on some, that person will relax with you, and then you'll pick up on more, and then you'll have a stronger, more healthy, more honest relationship with that person as a leader, and you'll hopefully get clearer, better, more accurate feedback that'll help you make better decisions as a leader. So that's the first one. The second one, that's the big one around unusual behavior. The other big one is any kind of emotion. So if somebody at work seems unusually attached to something, or they seem to get a bit frustrated or emotional about it, or they get flat out cranky about it, or there's often at work somebody's really cranky with something that someone else in another team has done. And, as a coach, I'm often thinking, you're taking that way too personally. Why are you taking that so personally? But if we actually were able to dig in, we would discover there is something going on there. And as a leader, if we can recognize those and then make a decision about whether we want to dig in and discover more, we can then again uncover a gold mine. The the challenge for a leader is the hints and clues are more subtle. If you pick up on them though, you improve your leadership and your efficiency, you know, tenfold. I mean, that's just a number on, but you just because if you go back to that idea of they don't tell you the real issue, if as a leader, if you dive in and start dealing with that issue, which is not an issue, you're going to spend time, money, resources, energy, effort on something that actually doesn't matter while missing the thing that does. And so as leaders, you could be wasting so much time on things that are only mildly important and miss those opportunities that are much more important. And, I worked in retail for a long time, and I think back on how we handled situations, and I was in customer complaints and how I handled some of those. And I think, if I'd understood then what I know now, I could have dealt with so many people and issues much more efficiently. We wasted so much time and money on things that just didn't matter. Um,
Mm.
I don't know if you use the position interest model, but there's a model that we use and which I think applies. It's, someone will come in with a position that they want, I want X. But if we actually say to them, what's your actual interest? What's the actual thing that you need out of this? We can actually come to a much better solution with them, a much more mutually beneficial solution a lot of the time. So this idea, I can give you a real quick example of that. Again, Emily, when she was 15 or 16, we were staying up at between Christmas and New Year, we go to a caravan park up on the beach north of Sydney, and she's made lots of friends over the years, and she wanted to stay up New Year's Eve overnight on the beach. And like most parents, so her position was, can I stay up overnight on the beach New Year's Eve? And of course, we said no. New Year's Eve on a beach with a whole bunch of people around, 15 years old, no. I think Emily knew us well enough that we then said, what is it that you really want? And so she wanted to stay up overnight. She wanted to stay with her friends and she wanted to see the sunrise. And so what she'd asked for was to stay on the beach. So we were like, okay, if we could find, because we knew her friends and we trusted them and liked them. So if we could find a place that we felt safe, because we don't think the beach is safe on New Year's Eve for a 15-year-old girl. So if we can find a place that's safe for you to stay up overnight with your friends, and then, I take you out to see the sunrise in the morning, would that do? And she was like, yes, that'd be great. So her and her friends ended up sleeping on the veranda of the cabin that we were staying in. Not sleeping, staying up all night on the veranda of the cabin. And in the morning, I woke up, took them across to the beach, and she was happy, and we were happy, and it worked out really well. But it's this idea of what's your position, what's your interest. It's this idea of getting to the deeper concern. So as leaders, if we can do that, we'll save a lot of time, money, effort, resources, etc.
And I was thinking as you were talking about that, and workplace example of that, where we're working on the wrong issue might be you have a person in your team who says to you, I don't find our team meetings particularly useful or valuable. And you spend a lot of time on how do we make this meeting more useful for you, and you rejig the agenda and you change topics and things. And the real issue might be I actually don't get on with somebody in the team and it's uncomfortable for me to be in the same room with them.
Correct. And I'm not saying what I want to say because I don't trust
Exactly.
them. Yeah.
Now, you talk about in the book that we all have fairly poor listening habits and there's traps that we fall into. And I was actually reading a blog yesterday where the title of the blog was They Stole My Story, which is
Mm.
about somebody who went to tell a story and someone jumped in and went, oh, I know exactly that, and started telling their own story. So which of these bad habits do you see most commonly in leaders? And what is it they can do about it?
I think there's probably two or three that are up there in the list, the top three. I think asking questions. So I see leaders who think they know what's going on and they think they know what needs to be done. And so they just hear sort of the first part of the issue, snap in thinking, I know what's going on here. And then they hit questions or opinions and suggestions. So if talking over people and interrupting them with either questions or the solution. And the challenge for a lot of leaders is that we end up attaching, this is why the integrated values iceberg is so powerful, because we end up attaching our identity to being the one that has the answers. So many leaders have so much identity attachment to I know. I know the answer. I know what to do. I can tell you what to do. I can solve your problem. I can fix it. I can this, I can that. And that actually, as they move through their career, that needs to change. And they need to attach their identity to how well their team is performing, as opposed to how great they think they are. Now, for some leaders, their ego won't let them do that. But for the majority of leaders, they can actually make that transition and they'll get better results when they do. But when they do have that ego and that attachment to I have the answers, they just interrupt all the time. And I'm sure you've done it. I've done it where we've sat in meetings and just watched leaders interrupt and thought you didn't even get close to what that person wanted to tell you then. So I can remember one particular client where they were getting a report from one of their people who is close to a particular customer. And that person had gone out and spent quite a bit of time with that customer and was coming back to kind of let the business know what that client needed. And the boss just came in over the top and cut them off. And I ended up interjecting because I could see that he'd taken it down a different direction and he'd taken it down the direction of what he thought the issue was. And I can remember interjecting and saying, just hang on half a second, you need to hear this and you need to finish this report before you move into action planning phase because you've just missed the message that they were trying to give you. And he was, I'd worked with him a bit and he was good enough to, like, as a character, good enough to accept that from me. I have done that in situations where I've never worked with that client again. But in this particular case, he was good enough to accept that from me and stopped. And then as the person continued their report, he was like, "Oh wow, yeah, I really did, I really did go down the wrong track." But it was just a great example of because often the people who get to leadership positions, their brains, they're trying to do so much so quickly, their brains just work at 110%. They're going at a million miles an hour. And so they just jump on things the minute they think they know, they jump on it and try to move it forward. And that's basically what he'd done. There was no malice in it. He was just, let's move this forward. It's like, hang on, you've missed by moving it forward. You're going to miss something here. And it was that ability to just watch. He could have, we go back to how the leader recognizes this. If he'd actually watched that person, because the only reason I knew, I didn't know the report, I just could see from the person, I was watching them, and when he interjected and took it a different direction, I could see their reaction and I could see them deflate and I could see them, wondering in their own mind, what do I do? What do I do? They get confused and like, can I challenge the boss? Can I not challenge the boss? Can I? So I saw that reaction and took that away from them, took that pain away from them and did it myself, to which he responded well and came back. But if he'd been switched on to that, if he'd been watching for that, he could have self-regulated and done that himself.
And look, that leads me into the next question I was going to ask you, which is about that, silence for leaders. And I think you've touched on a really important point, talking about that sense of urgency that leaders have all of the time. And that sense of needing to move things forward really fast means that there often isn't that reflective space, that sort of pause, take stock, that silent space. So have you got any advice for, say, leaders that do have that, I've got to say something because there's nothing being said, they need to fill the space all the time? Got any advice for them on how to, I guess, pause, hold that reflective space?
There's a couple of thoughts. One would be just get over it. Um, and that's a bit flippant and a bit rude on my part, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that if just give it that extra, we're talking seconds here. In I don't know, all the different facilitation training I've had all my career, one thing stood out, which was that when you ask a question to an audience, wait 7 seconds. Now, I don't know where this person got 7 seconds from, but she explained it in her mind is because they have to think through, they're going to ask a question. They think through whether their answer is going to be right or wrong. Then they have to think through whether it's going to make them look silly. Then they have to think through, and that takes them roughly 7 seconds. So I've kind of learned that. And it's interesting how long 7 seconds feels when you're the one who's asked the question, but how short it is in reality. So my comment to leaders would be, what does 7 seconds cost you in terms of waiting 7 seconds for the benefit? So if you did a cost benefit analysis, what you might then uncover just by waiting 7 seconds could be phenomenal. And the benefit of those 7 seconds then in your life could be amazing. So it really is just that there's no way of emphasizing better. Just give it a minute, give it a beat, give it whatever you call it, give it 7 seconds. If you're struggling with that as a leader, I would actually encourage you to go back to the integrated values iceberg and think about, what do I need to think? Because the belief values sit in the middle. And it would be, is there a thought that I need to think that helps me do that? So I'm as bad as anyone else. So when I first started thinking to myself, I've got to wait 7 seconds, I actually would ask a question to a group, and then my thought in my head would be 7 seconds. You just got to wait 7 seconds. So I'm consciously repeating that in my mind, and then I would count them. I must be up to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's really not that long. Um, so just, that integrated values iceberg will help you think about it. You can be really specific with what do I need to do? What do I need to think? Who do I want to be in that moment? Um, what I didn't, if I can just digress back for a second, what I didn't say about the integrated values iceberg, the reason that is so powerful is because your unconscious works with priorities. And so when you set priorities using that iceberg, using your values, you actually set new priorities for your unconscious. That's why it's so effective, so powerful. So that's thought number one. Thought number two is um, actually put some processes in place to help you do that. So there may be, for example, times in your meetings where you decide, you know what, I want to hear from everybody. So make that a process. I've asked a question. It's an important question. I need to know what we're all thinking about this. So I'm actually going to go around the room. And we're going to hear from everyone. I can remember with one particular example, one client, we introduced the process of starting every meeting with a really simple check-in. And the check-in was, what's foremost on your mind today with regard to what we're, to our strategy and our targets and what we're trying to achieve. And when she introduced that, it actually changed there were a couple of meetings where the entire meeting agenda went out the window because somebody raised an issue that the rest of the team weren't aware of. And it was like, wow, that's going to blindside us if we don't do something about that. Like, it was amazing what the team then raised. Your people are the ones out on the front line. They know what's going on. Give them the space and they will give back tenfold. So for me, it would be think about simple processes. So one is just do the waiting, put something in your mind like I'll wait 7 seconds. The second one is actually build a process into your meetings or into your interactions or into your uh, the process could be as simple as if you've asked a question, just wait for the answer. But just that one little, it seems just it seems so obvious and so common sense, but so many leaders don't do it. They think the space has to be filled. The thing for a leader to remember is when you've asked a question, it might seem like everything's quiet to you, but it's not quiet for them. Their brain's going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. They've got 100 thoughts, and so it's noisy in their mind. They're not even noticing that no one's saying anything because they're just so preoccupied. So just, if you just established a rule of wait for an answer, you might be surprised.
Yeah, I remember years and years ago, hearing, we called it the 3 second rule, that most people will only wait 3 seconds before they jump in and ask the same question again in a different way or ask something different, which means you've got the person who is thinking and they're like, I'm thinking about what I'm going to respond to. And now you've asked me a different question. And now I've got to rethink everything. So it's even going to slow them down. It's not going to speed them up by asking the question again in a different way. So I love that 7 second rule. I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah,
And you talk about leaders seeing themselves as problem solvers, which I think is true for a lot of leaders. It's what gets them the job in the first place, is being really
correct.
good at something technical. But you're arguing in favour of people being a sounding board, which I think is lovely. Talk about the link to culture. If leaders move from being problem solvers to being sounding boards, what do you think happens in the organisational culture? Or what have you observed?
It The really powerful answer is that it gives people what they want. So at a cultural level, in my experience, the everybody, everybody wants to be part of a great culture. And I say that fully aware of the recalcitrant, cynical, problem people that are out there and will passionately tell you they want to be part of a great culture as well. Leaders are not challenged by the desire. Everybody wants to be part of a great culture. What they're challenged by is the belief. So people want to be part of a great culture, but depending on their experience, won't believe that's possible. And one of the great things a leader can do to help people start to understand that that is possible, that we can build a great culture, that you can have the culture that you crave, is listen and engage and get their feedback and thoughts on that. So when leaders start to actually use the knowledge of their people and engage with their people in that way, their people will respond because that belief will start to grow that we can have a great culture here. Um, it's interesting you raise culture because I also wrote a book on culture. Um,
I'll look
so
that one up too.
yeah, it's a good little book. That was much smaller. That was just my take on keeping it simple. But that comment that everybody wants to be part of a great culture is drawn straight from that book, and it's my experience. Um, so yeah, the if I go back to like for the leader, what I would add to that I've just said about, if you engage with your people, they'll start to believe that a great culture is possible. You'll also start to hear what they think needs to be done. And that for me is critical in building a culture. We often just assume, culture's often just left as it just sort of happens. But when we actually think about it consciously and we actually talk about, okay, where are we trying to go? What are we trying to achieve here? And then if we actually engage with our people and say, okay, well, what kind of culture do we need to deliver that? So we've got a strategy for our business. A lot of leaders put time and effort into strategy, but then they don't actually put any time and effort into what culture do we need to deliver that strategy. And if they start to have that conversation, they'll get great response from their people. Their people will then start to really believe, actually, we can build this. We can build a culture that will really work here. And the benefit for the leader in that is profound. Their job as a leader is to make good decisions and make good decisions for the business. And they will make better decisions when they get better information. And if they engage with their people, they will get much more and much better and much more honest information. And then they, as leaders, can make much better decisions. So, it's a two-way street. Their people start to respond, the culture improves and grows, they get better information, they then achieve more. It becomes a wonderful cycle because that goes back into people feeling better about what they're doing. There's more, we all love being in a business that's doing well, and on it goes.
I was thinking about that, what you said earlier about how we can't be perfect listeners all of the time. And a lot of leaders would be really thinking about that balance of how do I balance productivity with being present for the conversations that really matter. Have you got any maybe daily practices that busy leaders can use to remain mindful of that listening approach?
I think I would actually, I would encourage a leader first, um, before we get to daily practices, I'd encourage them first to go back and really think about what it means for them to be a leader, and leadership in that specific context that they're in, because the different roles that they will have throughout their career will require different things of them as leaders. So I would highly encourage them to use the integrated values iceberg or something like that, if you've got a similar model or something like that, to just think through, who do I want to be? What's my greater purpose here? Just to get that clear in their mind and to reset those priorities, because that will make it easier to then do some of the things that they then need to build into their daily practice, because they'll start to believe in them more. Um, in terms of daily practice, my thought is I would encourage a leader daily, and they're going to struggle with this, to check in with their team. So depending on how big the team is, but I would suggest at some point during the day, go for a walk, find that person, and just check in. How are things going? What's what's bothering you the most today, or what's the big issue today, or what's really, and that 10-minute conversation could lead to, wonderful information. So that daily check-in, um, I think is, yeah, I would highly recommend it to every leader, and most leaders don't do it, because they don't have time. And so that's why I suggest think about the integrated values iceberg, because really, how do you want to be spending your time? If you don't think you've got time, you're probably doing too much work yourself and not relying on your team enough to deliver. And if you start to shift and use the integrated values iceberg to shift into who you need to be to get the best out of a team, as opposed to delivering something yourself, then you'll then start to realize actually that time I spend with my team is more productive. It gives me more output. Because you're talking about, let's say it's a team of 9 people, you're talking now about the output of 9 people being improved, as opposed to your personal output being improved. And then on top of that, you get all the benefits of learning what you learn and understanding and being able to actually identify what needs to be done and make better decisions and do all of that as well. So, just a simple thing like that, just checking with your team on a regular basis. Um, I would check in on, and I'd have a couple of topics. What's your focus at the moment? Um, are you clear on your role? Is there anything unclear about your role? Teams for me need role clarity and they need alignment around the goal. So goal alignment and then role clarity. So I'd be checking in on that. In terms of other daily routines, I think we can include, I, I would actually encourage leaders to ask their teams. So one of the things I tell leaders is, you know, if you just listen to your team, you'll get all of the leadership coaching you've ever needed. They want to coach you because they want you to do well. They want you to be a good leader. So if you listen to them and talk to them and ask them, then they'll give you. So ask the team, what else do we need to function more effectively? And I would encourage you to do that. I don't know. I don't know how it would depend on how often the leader's having their team meetings. And if they have them weekly, which most do, then I would say maybe every 6 weeks, make the meeting about how we're functioning as a team. And when you do that, you'll then again learn a lot, improve the efficiency of 9 or 10 people, et cetera, et cetera. So that'd be my main tips.
Yeah, I really love that. Well, that's been really useful. There's some fantastic takeaways in there for leaders. And I think the real message here in all of it, and I think for every organisation, is you've got to make that space to slow down, because that productivity push, that idea that we've got to be doing more, that sort of faster, more, the whole more with less that we hear a lot about, it's coming at a cost. And it's the cost of really, truly listening and truly hearing what your people have to say. And like you said, you're missing out on all of those amazing insights, and the whole productivity of the whole team can be impacted by leaders' inability to listen. So there's a lot in this book for everybody. So really encourage listeners to get hold of a copy of it. We'll put some links below the video so that you can purchase it on Amazon, bookshops, etc. It's in a lot of places. But yeah, Listening, a guide to building deeper connections. So thank you so much for your time, Ross. That's been really useful.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thanks.